Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third in a series of events which DNV and BDO are co-producing on a range of renewable energy-related subjects. The key aim of these sessions is to cover topics which we think will be of interest to investors in renewables and also those developing and operating renewable generation projects and technologies. We hope that by combining our passion for renewables with the insights of specialists that we meet on real projects, that we'll be able to generate some great debate and share insights which you'll hopefully find useful. I'm David Bevan. I lead BDO's renewables practice, which works with investors across a range of renewable technologies. I'll be chairing the meeting, and I'm pleased to say we're focused today on green hydrogen and its implications for renewables investors. We are absolutely delighted and I must say somewhat overwhelmed by the level of sign-ups we've had for this event today, and they've exceeded all expectations. I think this is probably testimony to the level of interest that surrounds hydrogen at the moment and its role in the energy transition. Much of the work I do is focused on generation assets, so battery storage, renewable supply chain, etc. And much of what I've learned about hydrogen really comes from market commentators. And from that, it's clear to me that hydrogen seems to be quite a polarizing topic. As a carbon-free energy vector, there does seem to be something quite tantalizingly elegant about hydrogen, and the optimists see it as a real panacea. Others, of course, are more circumspect and fear that it's expensive, inefficient, and has numerous challenges. I guess the truth lies somewhere in the middle of all of that, but I must admit, I doubt in the next hour or so we're going to resolve that question, but instead we're going to focus on the kinds of issues likely to be relevant to renewables investors who are exploring how developments in green hydrogen might impact their assets. We have a superb panel of experts for you today, including specialists in hydrogen technology, economics, law and regulations, and also a renewables investor. So before I go on to introduce Graham from DNV and Gus from SGN, who will be giving brief presentations to kick off the panel session, a few bits of housekeeping. Firstly, all attendees are automatically muted and will have their cameras turned off throughout the session. So please don't try to unmute yourself or turn on your video camera. You will be able to send your questions and comments using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. Please feel free to send your questions through during the panel session itself. You don't need to wait right until the end of that to ask a question. And time permitting, we'll try to go through a selection of those questions at the end of the panel session. We do plan to record the event so that everyone can access the session at a later stage. We'll be running some online polls during the panel session, so do keep an eye out for those. There's just one actually, so it shouldn't be too difficult to spot. And finally, we'll be making the presentation slides available after the event, so you don't need to do any screenshots or take photos as we go. Okay, so excellent. Enough of me. I'm really pleased now to hand you over to Graham Bennett, Vice President and Head of Energy Transition and Innovation UK at DNV. It will give us a quick overview of the hydrogen demand landscape. And secondly, a presentation by Angus McIntosh, Director of Energy Futures at SGN. He's going to give us a brief introduction to the real-life H100 green hydrogen project that SGN is leading in Fife in Scotland. So without further ado, if I could hand over to Graham and Angus to introduce yourselves.
So yeah, thank you for the introduction, David, and thank you to BDO for setting this up and providing the opportunity for DNV to share its views on hydrogen today. As David says, I'm Graham Bennett. I look after the energy transition and innovation function for DNV here in the UK. And what I'm going to try and do in the next 4 or 5 minutes or so is to give you a very, very brief run through on DNV's view on how the hydrogen market will evolve. As a bit of a precursor to the discussions we'll have later on in the panel session. So one of the things I wanted to address in today's discussion was why hydrogen now? I mean, there have been several false dawns for the so-called hydrogen economy in the past. So what is different about the current situation that we find ourselves in, and what's really driving so much interest, as David mentions, so much interest in the topic of hydrogen at the moment? So each year, DNV issues an energy transition outlook, and this is our forecast for how we see the energy system transforming over the decades out to 2050. There are a series of reports that are issued each year. You can see them on the screen there. They're all freely available for download from that top left-hand link. The reason why I'm showing you this today is this is the modelling work that sits behind our current view on the growth of hydrogen demand. So what does our energy transition outlook tell us about the role of hydrogen? Well, no apologies for this being a really busy slide, because at its heart, that's one of the challenges that we face today. The energy transition that needs to occur to bring us towards a net zero solution is complex, and it is multi-vector, and it will transition in several phases over the period out to 2050. Some of the technologies that we see emerging in the 2020s and 2030s will not be the technologies that we end up with in the 2050s. There is no magic bullet here. There is no light switch moment at which we're all suddenly going to stop using oil and gas and switch to a low carbon or zero carbon solution. DNV are one of the most positive forecasters you will find when it comes to the increased use of renewable sources in our power system and in the rise of electrification in transport. Nevertheless, our forecast shows that we're moving from a situation today where about 19% of our overall energy system is electrified to a situation in 2050 where we still have a 50-50 split of hydrocarbons versus renewable sources. Now, this is not necessarily the forecast we want to see, but it's the forecast we produce based upon the technologies, the policies, the regulations that we face today. So there's no element of blue sky thinking or what if or scenarios in here. This is the way we are heading currently. Now, the real challenge here is represented by those grey and brown peaks on the back of this slide, and they represent the molecular energy that we're using in our systems today, which is largely hydrocarbon-based. And today, around 6,000 day-to-day products, everything from paints and dyes through plastics and fertilizers and pharmaceuticals, are either manufactured from or are using high-temperature heat derived from oil and gas in that manufacturing process. And this is why hydrogen is so important, because hydrogen gives us the opportunity to achieve deep decarbonisation of industrial processes and manufacturing processes, which are represented by those grey and brown peaks in the background. So it's really in this area of industrial decarbonisation, heat decarbonisation in particular, that hydrogen will play a key role moving forward. So those of you who've been beginning to get an interest in hydrogen production will understand that this is a veritable rainbow of grey, blue, green, yellow, pink, red, lots of different sources of hydrogen production. So there are lots of different sources being proposed, and to a degree, most of them will play some part in supporting the growth of hydrogen for the future. The main production method today is via steam methane reforming of natural gas or of other hydrocarbons. This is a lower cost means of producing hydrogen today, but it's low cost because the feedstock, generally in terms of hydrocarbons, are cheap, and also because the cost of carbon is low. So although the blue hydrogen that we produce today from hydrocarbons, so the grey hydrogen we produce today from hydrocarbons does not capture the carbon that is subsequently emitted. With an increased carbon price on CO2 emissions, we are going to see the need for carbon capture and storage to be brought in to support blue hydrogen at scale. But as we move forward into the early 2030s, with an increasing carbon price on CO2 emissions, an increasing cost of gas, and the ongoing cost reductions that we expect to see in electrolysis-based hydrogen, we see the cost gap between green and blue hydrogen dramatically closing. And in fact, in the early 2030s, we believe that green hydrogen will be cost competitive with blue hydrogen at scale. And that's represented by those top two graphs you can see, which show the growth of electrolysis-based hydrogen and the fossil fuel-based hydrogen in various countries of the world out to 2050. In order to achieve a hydrogen economy, however, in order to make this transition happen, it's very, very important that we put consumers at the heart of this energy transition. You know, they are the ones that create the market for hydrogen, and they are the ones that need to be convinced of the need to make behavioural changes, of the need to make changes in the way in which they heat their homes, the way in which they generate their electricity, or the way in which they consume heat in industrial processes. Underpinning all of that is the ability that we have to convince the domestic and industrial consumers that we can do this safely. So safety research, as represented by that left-hand picture, that's the street of hydrogen houses that we built at the DNV Spade Adams site in Cumbria, where we're working with Ofgem, with BEIS, and with the gas networks to provide the evidence base that this hydrogen transformation can be done specifically safely in the domestic environment. We need to think about infrastructure development. Hydrogen behaves differently to natural gas. It has different properties, and in some areas we may need new or adapted infrastructure. We need to think about this topic of hydrogen production. Increasingly, if we're going to achieve deep decarbonisation of hydrogen production, we need to have low or zero carbon sources for the hydrogen we're going to use in the future. And underpinning all of that is a policy, regulatory framework, a legal framework within which a hydrogen economy can grow. It's very, very important for the industrial community and for the investment community to hear from government a very clear commitment to the development of a hydrogen solution, a green hydrogen solution, and one which is consistent. We can't afford to have policy changes. We can't afford to have colours of different governments of different colours changing their views on the energy system as it goes along, because that reduces the confidence of the industry to invest. And we really need a very solid and supportive series of government policies to enable this to happen. So I'm going to leave this here today. There are a number of research papers that we've issued for different topics on hydrogen. They're all free to download, and whether you're interested in decarbonisation of heat or whether you're interested in the use of hydrogen in the electricity value chain, please take an opportunity to download those materials. And if you have any questions, please fire them back at me or one of my DNV colleagues. So I'll leave that here today. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions in the panel session later, and I'll hand over now to Gus McIntosh of SGN Energy Futures. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning. So I'm Gus McIntosh. Hope you can all hear me well enough. I'm Director of Energy Futures at SGN. SGN own and operate the gas distribution networks in Scotland, everything south of the Thames in England, and also we have a footprint in Northern Ireland. And my role really is to push the frontiers of decarbonisation across all sectors. And today I'm going to talk to you a bit about H100. So what is H100? Well, it's actually a bit of a glimpse at what the future might look like. It is a turbine tip to burner demonstration project end to end. We're taking power from a renewable source in the form of a 7 megawatt offshore wind turbine. We're taking that power, we're putting it through electrolyzers fed by good old Scottish water, and then we're storing the hydrogen byproduct from that. The oxygen at the moment will be vented, but in future that will also be utilized. We're then taking that hydrogen, putting it into a distribution system that's around 8 kilometers that we will lay in parallel with the existing gas network of exactly the same materials that we use now. And that's about ensuring customer choice, which I'll explain in a minute. We also have a demonstration facility that's part of the project, which is quite critical for customers to come and interact with. And I'll talk about that in a second. And ultimately, we will be distributing the hydrogen to 300 homes. Now, why 300? 300 is the magic number in terms of statistical representativeness, so that we can scale this project in terms of all the learning and demand and supply, and understand all the impacts right through the chain. We'll be offering customers, it's an opt-in project. This is not compulsory participation, and that's really important. We need to make sure that customers are not disadvantaged in any way. So look, this forms part of what is a national endeavour to evidence the role of hydrogen and the potential for the gas distribution system in the UK to be converted to hydrogen, which would afford this significant opportunity for hydrogen to become a ubiquitous fuel, supplying a lot of sectors, particularly those that even at the moment aren't supplied by the natural gas grid, that are often perceived to be too hard to abate. It's also part of the 10-point plan. This is the neighbourhood component of the 10-point plan for those that have read it. The next part is the village and the next part is the town, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. But look, as part of this national endeavour, we're seeking to get to complete all of the research and development to prove the role by 2025. So that would afford this wherever, whenever approach in the gas distribution system for being able to accommodate hydrogen. Okay, if we, so just before I go, there's a myriad of outcomes expected from this project, as you can imagine. However, the two critical ones are the evidence for the suitability of the 280,000 kilometres of distribution pipe that we have in the UK, in GB. And the second but most important thing is the customer and understanding that customer appetite and what they want. So look, this is a safe trial, not a trial for safety. We've actually done a comprehensive amount of R&D looking at absolutely everything throughout the hydrogen area that we need in order to be able to deliver this. So, you know, from every component within the system, every material, the odorization, the commercial, regulatory, the ideal location to go and trial this from, and right through to boilers and the applications which have been funded, you know, through the likes of the Hy4Heat program. So there's been a comprehensive amount of R&D, which is, I suppose, been quietly done in the background, not just in the last sort of 6 months, but over the last decade. So what does it look like? Well, there is the offshore wind turbine. It is owned by the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, and you can see it is offshore, but not very far offshore, so you can actually walk to it. That turbine was a demonstration turbine as part of a former initiative. The area in which we are building is the Energy Park in Fife, which is a former colliery. And there's a number of, you maybe have recognised the likes of Bifab, and there's a decommissioning site. So there's a lot of industry in the area, and it is a former industrial town. The little triangular shape there, or polygon there, is where our site will be, but obviously the properties surrounding it are the target area for supplying the hydrogen. So a little bit about the area. So look, one of the things that is quite often missed in the decarbonisation debate is the customer. What does the customer want? What's suitable for their properties? And there are many properties across GB that are sort of hard to treat, 19th or early 20th century properties. You know, a lot of the insulation and the access and the space are major issues. So this project actually covers the full range really of property types, and it's really important that we bring every part of society with us on any decarbonisation journey. I mentioned customer participation is absolutely critical, and what we have here is a demonstration facility wherein customers will actually be able to come in and interact with the appliances and see what they look like in their home. And that's really important because actually when you get into the debate on decarbonisation, a lot of the options are pretty abstract until they really understand what that would mean for them. Important also to note that you know, without sharing all the complexities of it, the regulatory model that we're employing for this is also really customer centric in its focus. So customers don't have to change their energy supplier. We will do all of the work in the background. All they need to do is opt in to allow us to replace their appliances. But this centre will also double as an event centre and a training centre. So look, the engagement, customer sign up, there's a huge amount of activity here. And we've had a lot of experience in doing customer engagement and opt-in before. We did a big project in Oban, which was seeking to change gas quality for not just GB, but Europe as well. And it was very successful, and we learned a lot from that on how best to engage. And you're looking ultimately to get that community interest from the one-to-many approach, where you're trying to grab their attention, to the many-to-many, where they help you make it happen themselves. So I'm not going to go into the detail of exactly how we're going to do it, but the facility will be a critical thing and the events are really, really important. What are we putting in the homes? So you've maybe seen or heard of hydrogen-ready boilers. Hydrogen-ready boilers have almost exactly the same footprint as your natural gas boiler, and that's what's really, really attractive about them. And they've been designed such that they can be installed in advance of any system transformation, and then they can be retrofitted to work with natural gas with hydrogen in less than an hour. Of course, in this project, they're being installed ready for hydrogen, but they'll be reverse compatible with natural gas. So we're not just offering boilers. People also like to have fires and they like to have cookers. So we will also, as part of the Hyperheat program, these products and appliances have been developed. There are obviously significant changes in terms of the hydrogen characteristics. However, all of these have been overcome in the research and development such that you can still have the lovely glow from the fires that people want by tipping burners, for example. And it goes beyond just the appliances. We also need hydrogen-ready meters, and these have been developed too. So again, these will be SMETS2 smart meters for those that know a bit about that in the industry, and these can be easily converted between natural gas and hydrogen. So they also fit within the existing meter boxes. So look, conscious of time, hydrogen is a system transformation solution. That's what it affords. And this sort of picture here just demonstrates actually there's no changes required to wet central heating. There's no changes required to insulation, although I would always recommend that you improve your insulation in your home. There's no space to be removed for hot water storage if you don't have that now. All of these things are very, very attractive to customers. Essentially, all you're doing is replacing out the boiler and what appliances that customers want. So that means that everything is done upstream for the customer. They're not affected by all of the complexity of how we get that fully decarbonised energy to them. So I mentioned this is just the first phase, and actually under the 10-point plan, but also as our wider activity in Fife, there's a number of phases here. So this trial is all about opt-in, where customers can choose to participate. The next part of it is about conversion of distribution system in the surrounding area to increase up to the village scale. And then there's a view to increase to around 10,000 plus customers for the Fife region. There's lots of additional ingredients, and I mentioned before that hydrogen has the potential to be a ubiquitous fuel. It's arguably the Heineken of decarbonisation solutions in that it's probably the best for decarbonising a lot of the difficult ones. We've got some interesting work looking at the wastewater treatment in the area where oxygen byproduct is also really useful. We have industry in the region. We have opportunities for new hydrogen storage, and that is something that will be really important, particularly for green hydrogen going forward storage, because really, if you look at merchant basis investments in renewable technology, you want to be generating hydrogen all of the time to maximize the economic recovery of energy in these regions. So that's my time up, I think. So thank you very much for listening. If you go to the last slide, what I've done here is I've popped in the wee link to our video where one of my team during lockdown in Fife managed to produce the video, which was extraordinarily complicated to organise with all the microphones, etc. So if you have time, it's only a 5-minute video and gives you a great overview of the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angus. Fantastic, and thank you also to Graham for both your presentations, which I think are a really great introduction to the topic, and give a really clear vision, I think, for the decarbonisation of heat and industrial processes through hydrogen as a potential option. And Gus, your example really sort of brings things to life as to how this might really work in practice. What I'd like to do now is sort of kick off the panel session. And really the panel session will be sort of developing some of the themes and ideas within the presentation, and in particular, looking at the focus from a perspective of a renewables asset investor, owner, developer, how do some of these messages and signals impact the way they may be thinking and acting in the future? We saw a number of key themes came out of the presentations around need for government support, understanding the customer and the customer's needs and convincing the customer, and also touched on some other issues around safety, etc. So a number of these things we'll try and pick up in the panel session. But to kick things off, what I'd quite like to do is just to ask Anise, Paul and Antony to just, perhaps in that order actually, just to come on screen, reveal themselves and just introduce yourselves really, just give a minute on what you do and what your interest in hydrogen is.
Great, thank you, David. I'll start. Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Anise Ganbold. I work for Aurora Energy Research, and we are focused on modeling, analysis, price forecasts, and consulting for anything really related to energy. So we cover the electricity markets, gas, oil, coal, carbon, and now hydrogen. So we provide you with the tools to make investments or change your company strategy. Our clients would be people like investors, utilities, banks, developers, and of course, government bodies. So they look to us to help them make decisions in terms of any energy investments and other projects that they're making. So I'm based in the Oxford office, but we also have offices in Texas, in Sydney, Berlin, and we're opening one in Paris too.
Super, thanks Anise. Paul.
Yeah, good morning, David, and good morning, everybody. My name is Paul O'Donnell. I'm a partner at Greencoat Capital. And Greencoat Capital are one of the largest investors on a long-term basis in the renewable sector across the UK, Europe, and the US. We've been particularly focused on offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, and in recent months, we've also moved into heating projects and into waste energy projects as well. We're particular interest in the hydrogen sector. We've been doing our own review of it and sort of seeing where we see the opportunities emerging, how we see it intersecting with the kind of relationship partners that we have in the utilities in particular and the larger developers, and how we think it becomes an investable product for the sort of long-term, more patient capital that is looking to find a way to invest into hydrogen when the timing of that is. And so looking forward to discussing that this morning. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Paul. And Antony.
Hi, morning, everyone. So my name's Antony Skinner. I'm a partner in the Renewables and Decarbonisation Group at Ashurst. I focus on development, financing and M&A of power and renewable projects in the UK and in Europe. I've been working in the sector. I probably did my first renewables deal in about 2005. So I've been working on renewables deals for a long time. It's been great to see how they've evolved. So yeah, from a hydrogen perspective, I'm looking at it primarily from a sort of upstream generation perspective of renewable electricity, but increasingly how that interfaces with the new, in effect, off-taker of that green electricity. So looking at the rules and regulations around hydrogen from that perspective. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Antony. And thanks to all of our panelists. And as you can see, we've got a great collection of perspectives on the panel today. And before we dive into sort of specific questions, of which there are many, I'd just like to try out a quick poll, really just to sort of test the temperature of the audience, really, and the makeup of the audience. So firstly, hopefully everyone can see this this poll on screen now. So if your first question, if you're involved in investing in the sector, are you actively considering making an investment in green hydrogen? And by sector, I mean renewables generally. And second question, in future, do you see green hydrogen production as a realistic alternative to batteries for diverting renewables generation, for example, in the event of curtailment or low market prices? What I'm going to do is I'm going to kick off the panel session with a question, probably to Paul, but happy to hear views of everyone. Do you think, Paul, that investors have appetite at this stage for diversifying into hydrogen production? And if they do, what are the sort of conditions do you think that investors like Greencoat and others consider necessary to make those investments?
Yeah, it's a great question. mean, I think if we just see where we certainly see the sector at the moment, we've certainly seen a huge investment on the technology side and into more technology-driven investments in hydrogen over the last 2 to 3 years. And we've seen companies like ITM in the UK become a leading industrial powerhouse now in terms of sort of companies that are going to deliver the technology solutions around how we actually manufacture and produce hydrogen. And I think certainly there's a sort of built-up view that the demand for this type of technology is going to grow rapidly in the next 10 years. At the same time, it's recognized the demand isn't here now. And so we're having to forecast in terms of what the drivers are going to be to allow hydrogen to become an investable product, and what do we need to see to have that happen. And I think when we look at that, we look at the underlying investment case to support and look at what the value of the hydrogen is going to be that you produce and the cost to get there. And we try to look at that on a pan-European basis, and even further aside to look at the different economics between looking at how expensive it's going to be to produce hydrogen here in the UK and other European countries, and then comparing that against, say, further markets such as Saudi Arabia and Australia, etc., to try to decide where the winning markets are going to be. We're seeing huge, I think, early stage project development appetite. We're seeing the utilities, for example, investing large amounts of money in teams to look at where they see the winning cases being also. And a lot of early stage project development, similar to what you would have seen in offshore wind 10, 15 years ago, when that sort of first phase of offshore wind project development was happening. But what we're not seeing yet, I think, is the investment case around the sort of the large capex investments that are going to be required to essentially support that building out of those projects. We think that is coming. We think a combination of having essentially a falling levelized cost of electricity for offshore wind here in the UK, or the same for solar in Southern Europe. We think the fact that capex is coming down in terms of the cost of producing electrolyzers. And then finally, I think, the fact that we're seeing the ability to have high load factors, potentially even added to by the fact we will have wind that will need to be curtailed at time, or renewables that will need to be curtailed at time, creating the sort of investment case to support the investment into a combined renewables and an electrolyzer type solution or hydrogen type solution. But perhaps the piece that is missing, to answer your question, is the investment won't stack up on an unsubsidized basis yet. And we will need to see some level of government support for what the value of that hydrogen is. And I guess a pathway towards bringing down the cost of that hydrogen over the next 10 years. And I think in that, to then answer your question, I think investors will want to come in. There's appetite from medium and long-term investors to support that type of investment case. But I guess without some kind of a more contracted nature, a support from the government, a whole of regulatory approach, I think that will be the key to unlocking a sort of a sensible infrastructure type investment.
Yeah. Okay. So you're definitely looking at this seriously. You're looking at it globally, not just from a UK perspective, but you don't yet see anyone having made a clear economic case, a well-defined argument. That's really interesting. We'll probably touch on subsidies and support a bit later. One thing you mentioned was that you quite rightly mentioned that what's the value of hydrogen and what's the cost of producing it. Those are two fairly fundamental questions. Do any of the other panelists have thoughts on that, and in particular, what research is out there that assesses and addresses those questions, because they do strike me as fairly fundamental. What kind of materials are people seeing? Is there good information out there, or is it sketchy?
At Aurora, we're looking at modeling the hydrogen market. So we're actually already doing the work behind balancing supply and demand in Europe on a daily basis. So we're matching, like, what does it actually cost to produce hydrogen using the resources you have between now and 2050? And then what do we see as the demand for hydrogen across the different sectors? So still, like, what is the cost? What is the price the industry is willing to pay for hydrogen versus what does it cost to produce the hydrogen? So we're putting the pieces together and figuring out, like, what is the actual demand we're going to see, how much hydrogen is going to be economical to produce. So we're doing that analysis. We started with Great Britain and Germany, but we want to add a bit more complexity, like what about hydrogen imports from further afield? Will that knock out domestic hydrogen, and consumers are going to favor that instead? So it's not a yes/no answer, but yeah, it's something that Aurora is looking into.
That sounds like hugely complicated modelling. Is that so? That's a work in progress, and when do you expect to have to be able to share that, or will that be something? What's the outlook for that piece of work?
It's already available to our subscribers, so we already have that basic version online, and we're just adding new features to it as we go along.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks, Anise.
There have been several studies already done which are in the public domain by IEA and others as well. I think it's incredibly regionally specific, because to touch on some of the comments Paul made, it comes down very much to the question of subsidy. Some of that also comes down to the question of political preference as to whether or not governments prefer to subsidise green versus blue. But in some parts of the world, the cost of electricity, particularly for electrolysis-based hydrogen production, is widely different. So if you were to compare, UK electricity prices versus some electricity prices in places like Norway, there are some significant differences on the hydrogen price from region to region, and indeed from country to country, depending upon the source of that electricity.
Yeah, okay. Is it worth, just in terms of jargon, it might be worth, some of the audience might not understand the distinction between green and blue hydrogen. Is it worth, Graham, just giving one 30-second explanation of the difference?
Yeah, so generally today, blue hydrogen is the description used for hydrogen which is produced from methane reforming, either in steam methane reformers or autothermal reformers, where we're cracking the methane to produce a hydrogen component and a CO2 component, carbon dioxide component, and we're capturing that CO2 and storing it safely underground for forever. And so that's blue hydrogen, whereas green hydrogen is the process of using an electrolyzer or something similar to crack water molecules, H2O, to produce a hydrogen and oxygen stream, as perhaps indicated by Gus's earlier chart, where we are able to produce that either from grid electricity, where there's it could be a balance of it could be green hydrogen, green electricity, or it could indeed be normal grid electricity, which could be a mix of coal, gas, other sources of power from the grid. But that's generally described to be green hydrogen.
Okay, thanks, Graham. There's a lot in that first question, and I think my main takeaway is that, as Paul suggested, that there's lots of interest, lots of people exploring this, not a huge amount of real transactions, kind of commercial transactions happening. The activity is either at the technology level or it's a development site level, a bit like Gus's project, which I guess is to be expected, and we'd certainly hope to see more M&A type activity and investments in the coming years. I'm going to flip things around now, just perhaps going back to Gus, I guess. Could you talk us through what the main practical challenges are of, I'll use the word co-locating, or putting electrolyzers next to renewable energy generation equipment? I think generally it seems to be wind that people are doing this with rather than solar, but I guess either could apply. What are the practical aspects? Is it safe to do it? Can you do it in an automated way? What are the constraining factors?
Well, a lot of these will probably come out of the project. We don't necessarily, to quote the Donald Rumsfelds, there's the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. So, in terms of what we know, right, it's quite a complex matching of intermittency in generation, and of course the particularly skewed heat demand. And that's really important to understand across the whole system and the energy sector, because you see a lot of things where people assume all sorts of different efficiencies for the system. But what's really important is, how do you scale that? How do you turn that intermittency in generation into useful energy? And so a lot of the project will be about the learning of that and how it interacts with storage and how we manage that and the resilience of the system. The control system will be really important. We will also be taking a direct connection behind the meter to the turbine, And it's quite complicated as well from a regulatory perspective. So we have, we have power purchase agreements that we're doing, and there's also a lot of complexity in the actual commodity balancing for the project, where you don't just need to consider the electricity price in that, you need to consider the gas price, because we're balancing the customers. In terms of the practical considerations on site, there's when you've got to think about all the things from drainage to planning to everything else, but a lot of it is general sort of stuff. How are you going to connect? Where's your substation? Where's the positioning of things? The hydrogen storage site itself obviously has a huge amount of work gone into ensuring that it's safe in terms of failure modes or consequences. So you do have a large number of things really to juggle that ensures that the site is appropriate. But it's an increasing trend. What you're seeing a lot of actually for direct hydrogen production is movement, particularly in offshore. So you maybe heard of the Dolphin project. So that's looking at integrated electrolyzers into the offshore solution, and that of course plays to the at-scale deployment, but also simplifies a lot of some of the issues that we have on the ground when we're doing it the way we're doing it just now.
Do you think the renewables industry should seriously consider developing and investing in renewables projects that solely aim to produce hydrogen, as opposed to perhaps doing a bit of both? Anise, do you think that's a realistic expectation of the industry? Do you think people like Greencoat might start doing that rather than connecting to grid? They'll just solely use all their offtake to produce all their generation to produce hydrogen.
I'm happy to jump in there first, and maybe Anise can kind of give a wider perspective on it as well. I think we absolutely think that hydrogen as a standalone product will make sense, that you don't need to combine this with essentially selling power to the grid, but that you could essentially see standalone renewables assets that generate, so that are used solely to generate hydrogen. And I think it comes down to economics, and in our view at the moment, when you look at the economics, there's three elements I think that are going to be important to this. I think the first is the cost of the actual levelized cost of energy when you're from a renewables perspective, in terms of the power price to then produce to power the electrolyzer. And today, maybe in the UK, we see offshore wind at roughly speaking £40 a megawatt hour. And the question is, what kind of trajectory is that on in the next 10 years, and how low can that go? And I guess the same applies in solar across Europe in terms of where will the levelized cost of solar go to? The second is the capacity factor, and I think at the moment, UK capacity factors for offshore wind are 40 to 50%, and I guess one of the interesting questions becomes, if we start to see wind being curtailed, if we start to see wind not being able to be powered onto the grid, because it's too much renewables on the system at a point in time, how do we deal with that sort of pricing mechanism, and how do the government sort of signal around what the cost is of that fuel? Mm-hmm. And then finally, it's the cost of the electrolyzers. So today, when you read the research and talk to the technology companies behind the electrolyzers, they're all forecasting substantial cost down from I guess industrial savings. And we think, in long term, the biggest driver in our view is the levelized cost of electricity. And I think and I don't know what Anise is, if your analysis confirms this, but we certainly think that come 2030, the UK in particular should be well positioned to support a strong investment case for hydrogen only.
I'll jump in. I think it's a really good question. A lot of people talk about the production side, but then some people forget talking about the demand side. So when we speak to clients who are thinking of having this kind of project, what they really want first is an off-taker. So we see off-takers being kind of the pinch point. You can play around with the economics. So we also see costs coming down quite quickly. Depends on a lot of factors, which I can explain. But what people are saying is we really need an off-taker. The off-taker probably needs subsidies. And so that's really the limiting factor. So it's not really a question of, should I use curtailment? Should I use renewables solely for the producing hydrogen? First, you really need to tackle the issue of who's going to take my hydrogen, how much are they willing to pay for it? Yeah, so that's one side. The production side is really interesting. So everyone keeps talking about this magical $2 per kilogram number. Like, how do we reach that number? Of course, we are doing a lot of modeling behind it to see who can reach it under what conditions. There are kind of two ways in which you can get the cost down quite quickly. One is if you have a renewables asset that is producing power quite cheaply for the electrolyzer. So one option is, yeah, you can use curtailment. But however, what people forget is actually curtailment doesn't give you that much power. So around like 2 to 3% of renewables is curtailed. That wouldn't give you much power, and that wouldn't give you much hydrogen. But if you have curtailment and a very small electrolyzer, so like a 1 to 10 ratio, then you could produce hydrogen quite affordably. If you just use the renewables asset, then you just have like a 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 ratio, and that can give you quite affordable hydrogen. But in our modeling in Great Britain, those two methodologies still give you a cost of around $3 per kilogram. So something else has to change. Either our CapEx assumptions have to come down much more quickly, or the electricity that you get from the renewables asset is very cheap. So we still assume that if you use curtailment, the power costs something because the power is still a commodity. That if you can get really cheap electricity, so roughly like 20 to 25 euros per megawatt hour of electricity, then you can start to compete against blue hydrogen, and then also start to compete against gray hydrogen in like the 2040s period. So a lot of those things come into play. Subsidies are really important. So even if you have $2 or $3 per kilogram of hydrogen, what are you competing against on the demand side? So if you're an industrial, you might be using coal. That is much cheaper than $2 per kilogram of energy. So you need to have some sort of subsidies to make the economics stack up, even if you hit that magic $2 number.
Can I just add a couple of points on that? I mean, interestingly, I think what you're talking about there is almost what's called a direct wire PPA, so that the generator is connected directly to the consumer and therefore not going through the grid. And so you can actually get a supply license exemption from that. So that can have huge savings for both, or for the off-taker and then for the generator, in terms of not having to pay all of the additional supply license costs to fund things like the capacity mechanism, the CFD, etc. So that's one point. But I think also when you're thinking about a sort of bankability analysis with that sort of direct wire PPA, both from a generator and an off-taker, you would want some sort of grid connection as a backup, both from an off-taker's perspective. What if your generator isn't generating? You want a backup supply of power, and similarly from a generator's perspective, what if your off-taker isn't off-taking, or goes insolvent, for example? So increasingly we're looking at these sort of grid structures, and you potentially having a joint venture grid company, so that the grid infrastructure is owned by both generator and off-taker.
I think the grid connection one is quite interesting. Just quickly to add, so we've also looked at what happens if the electrolyzer is connected to the grid as well. So the modeling aside, actually connecting to the grid is really expensive for all of the grid charges and the taxes and levies. So we found that in Germany, like 2/3 of the levelized cost of hydrogen, if you're grid connected, is just the grid fees and levies. So the grid is really good as a backup, but then you also have to come up with pay for all of these extra costs as well.
And I think just to build on that, I think you're seeing, actually, particularly in Europe, you're seeing sort of non-grid related, so non-grid connected plants, and you're seeing industrial companies being the first movers in that space. Maybe, whereas the UK at the moment, we seem to be sort of waiting for more of a feed-in tariff type solution, and putting the hydrogen through to the grid or into an industrial rather than industrial process. We've seen, large chemical companies in both Germany and in Spain, looking at standalone hydrogen plants that they will use to produce ammonia or to produce some kind of chemical feedstock. and again, they're looking at, standalone renewable assets, up to 300 megawatts in size, where they then will put their own on-site electrolyzer to produce a fuel or to produce a commodity. So I totally agree with that, and I think each country is kind of still finding its feet in terms of what way the economic model is going to make sense. But in both of those cases, you need either a government backing up the price of the power of hydrogen, or you need a strong corporate sitting behind the value of the feedstock on a long-term basis.
Yes, so that's really interesting. $2 per kilogram sounds like as you say, a magic number, and perhaps that's one we can revisit in a year or so's time and see whether that number's changed, how close we are getting to that. Before we get on sort of detailed delegate questions, I thought I might just turn to something which has been mentioned a lot in today's session, which is subsidy and also government support more generally. I think, Paul, you mentioned, the economic case hasn't been made. Well, to an extent, the government maybe has a role in helping to elicit or make that case for lots of different reasons. I'd quite like to get the panel's views generally actually on what is the best way for government to encourage and incentivize and provide a roadmap for hydrogen.
Let me go first on that. I mean, I think, as people have already said, clearly there is a need for subsidies. When you look at renewable power generation over the years, and it's been hugely successful as we move from feed-in tariffs to the renewables obligation and to CFDs. But I think arguably in a hydrogen context, it's actually even harder, because not only do you need the subsidies, you need the markets there. And obviously when we were going for the green electricity, that there was always a market for electricity, whereas here, with hydrogen, there isn't an obvious market right now for hydrogen. So from an investor's perspective, they really need certainty, certainty of price, but also certainty of demand. So I think the challenge here, and we've got the sort of classic chicken and egg from a government perspective as well, is that the people that would naturally build the infrastructure aren't building the infrastructure because the demand's not there, and the demand isn't there at the moment because the infrastructure is not there. So we've got a real challenge there, I think, to kickstart that, and people are looking to the government to try and do that. And obviously, the EU has come out with their strategy, with hydrogen strategy. It's more of a route map than a clear how we're going to achieve this. It has started looking at things like the EU ETS and potentially having a contract for difference linked to the carbon price under the EU ETS. So that's one way of doing it, but even then, you still need the demand for the hydrogen.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also, I guess, the customer aspect to this that Graham mentioned right at the beginning is, the customer needs educating in certain applications of hydrogen. The customer needs educating and convincing, not just about safety, but about everything else. I wonder whether could subsidy come in that way in terms of the demand side, subsidising boiler technology or whatever it might be. What are other people's views on how government should be helping us?
I'm going to come.
Yeah, go on, Gus.
I was just going to come in there. So, look, design of subsidies is really important in the short term. We would always advocate that. Certainly during the early progression through the technology readiness levels, that's a great time to get support for projects that are clearly not commercial. But then beyond that, it's the support through the commercial readiness levels or commercial readiness index up until you get to that bankable asset. But that subsidy, you need to make sure then is best value overall in terms of GB residents and GB customers. And so, how you look at the socialization of costs over a longer period is really important. So it's not, when you look at it, you can't just look at it now in terms of what the cost is, right? Because the carbon price will dictate what the price of natural gas is. For example, in 2030, hydrogen will be cheaper than the current natural gas price based on the projection of carbon tax. And actually, you will see potentially an equalization of the cost of different sectors because the carbon price will dominate. So I think there's the design subsidy is really important. You need to recognize it's got to have that longer term payback to the customer. And you know, you need to be careful in terms of the socialization of that cost to make sure that you don't disproportionately affect, for example, fuel poverty on the heating side. But you know, it cannot be skewed. So the sort of solutions that we're looking at in heat is where you can convert the network, allows that socialization of cost and the sort of hockey stick, if you like, of how fast do you want to go in terms of decarbonisation, either through blue or ultimately then through green, which is the aspiration.
I think the other thing to bear in mind here, certainly business models and cost subsidy is critically important, but I think the other thing to remember is the role of government in establishing supportive policy, because you know, in order to move at the speed we need to move at to achieve net zero, existing rules around planning, existing rules around some of the things we have to do to enable some of these large infrastructure projects to go ahead also need to be enabled by government, and we need to look at these projects from a national infrastructure perspective, and possibly even need a national infrastructure body to try and push these things forward. A great example of that happened only yesterday, where the Asian Renewable Energy Hub, which was a major project in Australia to produce, to use solar farms to produce green hydrogen for subsequent conversion to ammonia and export from Australia to Japan, $26 billion worth of investment was called in and stopped by the Australian government on environmental grounds, because they were unhappy with the size of the solar farm and they didn't like the export option and the shipping routes. So government also needs to provide an enabling framework with clear and consistent policy to support this transformation as well.
I agree with what was said about demand, but also Graham's point. So we rank countries in Europe according to the administrative and legal rules around working in hydrogen, and the UK doesn't rank very well there due to all the regulations in place. 2 points I wanted to add. One, I was following 2 weeks ago, the EU said that they could allow subsidies for gas pipelines if they plan to switch to hydrogen. So say what you want about subsidizing gas, but if you allow grid blending in your country for hydrogen and you have the right guarantees of origin certification, you immediately have an offtake of hydrogen. So I think that is one way that the government could help the hydrogen economy. The second one, which doesn't have to do anything with money, it's essentially free, is certification. So if the governments are a bit more clear on what counts as low carbon hydrogen, zero carbon hydrogen, and how to regulate it, then we can really have the hydrogen being produced in Iberia where it's cheaper, and then being moved to the UK where the demand is going to be in a quite seamless way. So governments have been quite slow to have these sort of certificates and these like labelings of low carbon hydrogen, but I think that's going to be really essential.
Yeah. Okay. And is the British government working on anything? Is anyone aware of you know, consultation papers? What's actually happening right now, or is there not much?
Well, no, we've promised a hydrogen strategy and a hydrogen consultation imminently. I mean, I think as part of the white paper and the 10-point plan at the end of last year, I think it was June 21 that we were expecting that. So hopefully we'll have some clarity soon.
I think though as well, I mean, notwithstanding the regulatory uncertainty, and we are in an uncertain environment, the opportunity is huge. And one of the reasons for that is the UK has such a phenomenal offshore wind resource. I mean, and it's obviously an island grid as well. So it doesn't have that sort of backup of low carbon baseload power that sort of other markets might have, be that obviously has it through nuclear, but as nuclear phases away, that will come out, and other Nordic regions have hydro, etc. So I think you know, the investment backdrop to having a substantial amount of offshore wind is there. It's laid out. It's going to happen in the next 10 years, and obviously the case now needs to build for how we integrate hydrogen with that. And I think policy is heading in that direction, and the investment case is heading in that direction, and therefore finance money, you know, and investors and long-term capital will buy into that concept. We're just a little bit early in terms of understanding what the very, you know, all the details of that are going to be, but you very much can see that sort of offshore wind plus hydrogen becoming a very stable investment case kind of as we get a bit further down the line.
Yeah, fantastic. Just going to turn now to some questions from the audience, and just pick up one comment you just made, Paul, about sort of timings. Someone has asked, what will be the timeline for most electrolyzers having dedicated renewable plants, and B, electrolyzers directly connected to the grid independent of the supply source? I guess that's picking up on a observation that Anise made earlier. Would anyone dare to give some timetable guesses?
I can give a suggestion based on our electrolyzer database. So we've been tracking all of the electrolyzers we've heard of globally. So everything that's commissioned, everything that's planned, everything that's still an idea. So finding trends in that kind of data. A lot of the electrolyzers, when they do report who is going to supply the power to the project, the majority is solar and wind. But grid-connected electrolyzers is actually not that far behind. So I think the grid-connected and the dedicated renewables are really going to go hand in hand, depending on the country, depending on your use case, etc. The next question was, yeah, so when will they be dedicated renewables? Definitely.
Soon.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other responses to that timetable? While I just flick through the many questions we've been receiving. No. Okay. Can you elaborate on differences between offshore hydrogen production versus an onshore hydrogen plant? When is it feasible to build offshore hydrogen structures? So I guess differences other than the fact one's onshore and offshore. Can anyone elaborate on the differences there? I guess economic, etc.
So certainly, I don't think I think one of the key ways we would look at that from an investment case is around the economics, and I think you do look at it on the economics. And in certain parts of Europe, onshore wind is lower cost, than offshore wind. So you see that particularly in Scandinavia, where they can back that up also with a large amount of flexible hydro. The investment case looks quite positive there for in the short to medium term around hydrogen. I haven't seen the technical impact of where you would put the electrolyzer on an offshore basis. My current view is you probably put the electrolyzer onshore. You just bring the power in from the offshore wind farm to the electrolyzer onshore. So it's very much an economics, and you're seeing areas already like that in the UK. The Humber region, for example, looks to be an area where there may be some, it would be one of the near winners of electrolyzers being located, and obviously being powered by a lot of the near-term offshore wind farms.
Yeah, I must admit, it does, kind of, to layman, it would feel putting electrolyzer actually next to a turbine offshore does feel there's just more stuff to have to service and so on. So there must be kind of inherent cost there.
I was just going to chip in there and say, like, engineering is awesome, right? You can engineer pretty much anything, the Dolphin project, for example, seeks to come online in 2024, so we'll get some interesting things from that. I think one of the big things that changes with having offshore hydrogen production is there's no need for a proximate network connection. So when you look at a lot of the suitable sites in terms of terrific load factors that have been ignored because of their proximity and their ability to get that energy away, putting that into hydrogen and into hydrogen pipelines, which is a terrific way of moving energy about, becomes really attractive. To get that, you need a couple of things. You need storage at scale, and you need that demand that we've been talking about. But whether it's servicing the power sector, and ultimately it's a power in the home type solution, or a power to end user solution, or a hydrogen to point of use, you're going to need that hydrogen in terms of system resilience. It's common to any of the decarbonisation pathways.
Yeah, I think David, when we've looked at this, I think we've proved the feasibility of offshore hydrogen production, and it can be done. But I think our view would be that tends to be based on energy islands rather than individual turbines, or a small group of turbines connected to a central hydrogen production hub. You need to do it at scale, and it's much more likely to be on an energy island concept. Whereas Gus mentioned, you've got pipeline export option. You may even have a ship export option, from the creation of hydrogen in locations where we've got tremendous wind resource, but we can't connect that to an electricity grid for reasons of distance or for reasons of subsea topography, seabed layout configuration. But it needs to be scale. You need to have scale to do that and to make it commercially viable.
Yeah. Okay. We've got a few questions here around, well, the common theme is basically safety. We touched on it very briefly, I think, in one of in Gus's presentation, but and this perhaps ties into the customer conversation, the convincing the customer. What are the real safety issues with hydrogen in all its applications and forms and its distribution, etc., and storage? Are they? Gus, you mentioned that it's amazing what engineering can do, and do you see safety as a real issue?
So, I mean, if you just take, you know, the distribution system and within the home, the natural gas network is a couple of 100 years old, right? It's actually only in recent history that we weren't distributing hydrogen from the time we did town gas conversion. That used to be up to 50% hydrogen. So it's not unknown to us. But the other thing about the features of the natural gas system is it is incredibly safe. It's a very reliable asset when you look at the numbers, and we've got the opportunity to make it that bit safer. So, you know, some simple safety devices that are in the home, things that have actually, you know, been introduced since perhaps say 1993 with the Gas Appliance Directive. You know, having flame failure devices. All of these things we can make it safer in the home in terms of how we structure it. And the distribution side, there are different characteristics. You have to understand how to manage it. I go back to my engineering is awesome point, right? There's nothing that you can't engineer. You just have to understand what it is that you're trying to do and mitigate it. The kind of things that you need to look out for are hydrogen has a very high flame speed, which means that it's more prone to more significant ignition, and overpressure is a bigger issue than fire. For example, it can go on fire, but it's less of a radiant heat issue and more of an overpressure issue. So that affects things like how and where you site certain bits of kit. But again, you know, it's just about how you manage a hazardous substance, and we've been doing that in this country for hundreds of years. It's just switching one hazardous substance for another. We've got a lot of expertise across, you know, natural gas, oil, and and other hazardous substances. So, provided we understand the gas, then safety can be managed out.
Thanks, Angus.
Just one point on safety as well. And at the moment, again, there aren't any regulations published around the sort of health and safety in relation to hydrogen. So again, that's a sort of further barrier to entry from a investor perspective, because they don't know what they're going to have to comply with in the future. So how can they design something now when they're not sure what it's got to comply with? So again, a nudge to government to come out with some policies on that.
Thanks, Antony. We're very close to time, so I'm just going to ask one last question that's just come in. Which electrolysis technology do you think will dominate the green hydrogen market? We've got PEM, which has flexibility, and RES with some manufacturers. But what are views on what technology in that space will dominate?
Going back to our electrolyzer database, we found that when people say which type of electrolyzer they're building, it's usually PEM, so it's edging ahead. As the person rightly said, PEM is more flexible, so it's much more better to be paired with renewables. And we found that actually, even if you're grid connected, it still pays to be flexible, because if you can just produce hydrogen when the power price is cheap and then not produce when the power price is high, you can get a much lower levelized cost. So I would see there's still a market for alkaline, but PEM is going to dominate.
I would chip in and say it very much depends on what you're using it for. If reliability dominates, then at the moment you would say alkalines have a longer operating history. PEMs theoretically can, as Anise has said, are more flexible to demand changes, things like that. But it very much depends on what the structure of your site is and what the optimal thing is. What you're seeing is a significant advancement in both technologies actually planned over the period. And yeah, there's some exciting stuff happening there that's increasing that reliability and the efficiency particularly.
Okay, so it depends very much on the application. Okay, well, thanks so much, panel. We've come to the point where we need to sort of wind up. Thanks very much again. Thanks for sharing your broad views and your different perspectives this morning. It's been really fantastic education for me and hopefully many others watching this morning. I think the key takeaways is really hard actually to summarize all the takeaways, but there's lots in there. It's clearly, which is interesting to me in particular, that there's lots of investor appetite for this. While there isn't huge volume of transaction activity right now, it does feel like it's coming. I think Anise's $2 per kilo is quite a key number that we'll all probably remember and take away. And also the fact that lots of modelling is being done by, I'm sure, Aurora and many others in what's a really complex area. It's pretty safe, despite what some people say, the naysayers. But really, the key message, I think, for me is that we likely need subsidy, and we certainly need some kind of government-led roadmap that talks to the economic argument that helps customers understand the benefits and risks and so on associated with hydrogen. So fantastic. Thanks to everyone again who took time out of their days to join this morning. And thanks, of course, for sharing your various questions. Really sorry if we didn't manage to pick up your burning issues. We'll do our best to revert to everyone who's asked questions today. We'd love it if you could give us some feedback actually on the session. We are going to pop a link up into the chat box or the Q&A box shortly that will give you a link to a simple form that will allow you to do that. And we'll also, I think, circulate the same thing by email to the delegates. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will have a recording available for the event, so do feel free to share that link with colleagues who you think might be interested. And finally, on behalf of BDO, DNV, the panel, thanks again for attending this morning. We look forward to seeing some of you again in the autumn when we do our next event. And in the meantime, have a fantastic summer.